Thanks, Jennifer. Friends, we're here at this moment to share the joy and the privilege of bestowing a much-deserved honor on Howard Radest for his lifelong commitment to ethical culture and to the promotion of humanist ideals in their many manifestations. And it is a special privilege for me to be able to say a few things about Howard and about his extraordinary devotion to those values that have shaped his life. And through that devotion, he has animated our movement and has given it substance, integrity, and respectability far beyond what it would have possessed had Howard not been on the scene. If you feel the importance of ethical culture in your life, and if you profess humanist values, whether you do not know Howard well or do not know him at all, your life too has been enriched because of the devotion which Howard Radest has brought to our common cause. I personally have known Howard for more than 43 years, and my personal debt to him is very huge. Let me tell you a few things about Howard, but even if I were to tell you a lot about him, I would just be relating the opening chapter of the contributions he has made to humanism and to ethical culture. Howard Radest attended high school in Far Rockaway, where one of his teachers was Joseph Blau, who became an esteemed professor of history and philosophy at Columbia University and himself a professional ethical culture leader. Howard was educated at Columbia, another venerable West Side institution, West Side New York institution, together with the New York Society, and Howard was awarded his PhD there, writing his dissertation on the educational philosophy of Felix Adler, our movement's founder. But Howard's first professional involvement was as the founding leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, which he served from 1956 to 1953. When Howard arrived in Bergen County, he was a very young man, still in his 20s. But because of his seriousness of purpose, his organizing abilities, and his keen intelligence, he was able to bring around him and nurture the devotion of a significant number of solid, very talented lay people who became the pillars of the community and set the course of that society for the next half-century. Those founding members remained loyal and active far beyond Howard's tenure, and their influence and his are still actively felt up until this very moment. Today, the Bergen Society continues to thrive, and speaking personally as its current leader, I owe a profound, heartfelt, and lasting debt to Howard for having so successfully laid the groundwork that I and nearly 200 members of the Bergen Society continue to enjoy. If I can borrow from a baseball metaphor, Bergen is the house that Radest built, and hundreds of people, perhaps thousands, have been Howard's beneficiaries. From the Bergen Society, Howard moved on to become the executive director of the American Ethical Union. He was indeed an activist director, and the program of the AEU was back then a fulfillment primarily of his vision and his determination. We had a lobby in Washington shared with the Unitarian movement and the AHA. Under Howard's leadership and because of his direct intervention, we won conscientious objection status for non-theistic conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War. We sponsored a project which provided leadership training for promising minority young people in the South. We were half owners and editors of the Humanist magazine. The movement played a prominent role in agitating for a woman's right to choose, and the AEU was involved in a dozen other causes that Howard helped to inspire. It was the most expansive and active period for the AEU in its modern history. And speaking of history, if I remember correctly, it was during his tenure as executive director of the AEU that Howard completed Toward Common Ground, the only history of the ethical culture movement ever written. It continues to be an essential resource for scholars writing about us and the social context out of which ethical culture emerged. After his directorship of the AEU, Howard took a brief respite of a few years from paid professional work in ethical culture to become a professor at the newly established Ramapo College, a somewhat experimental liberal arts college in northern New Jersey. But he continued his work in organized humanism by seeking broader horizons and serving as one of the presidents of the International and Humanist and Ethical Union. During the Cold War years, the IHEU had 3 presidents, one from Western Europe, one from the US, and one from the communist bloc, usually Yugoslavia. I think Howard loved the multicultural ambiance of the IHEU. He operated comfortably and adroitly with his foreign counterparts as he steered the IHEU representatives through sometimes cantankerous meetings of the IHEU board and international congresses. Through Howard, we all learned that humanism was a global phenomenon that extended its reach far beyond the confines of the United States. Through Howard, we all became part of a world community. Howard moved closer to us again when he joined his skills as a teacher with those as an administrator to become the director of the Ethical Culture Schools, a position that he held for several years. Howard has always been a powerful believer in institutions as the embodiment and transmitter of values and ideas. He has always combined the creativity of a visionary with that of a strong institutionalist and organization builder, I dare say 2 characteristics seldom found in the same personality. My chronology may be a bit off, but it was around this time that Howard established the Moral Education Center at Columbia University, his alma mater, where he could build on the work of John Dewey and those other luminaries of humanist and ethical thought. That institution, by the way, continues to flourish. It came time for Howard to retire, but not really. Howard and Rita relocated to the warmer climes of South Carolina, but he never truly left us. In short order, Howard, ever the believer in the ecumenical project, was a founder together with Sherwin Wine of the Humanist Institute and became for many years its founding dean. As such, he set the tone for the Institute, raised funds to help ensure its survival, served as mentor to its students, and was the intellectual and administrative heart of that organization, which continues to thrive decades after Howard helped bring it into being. It was in South Carolina that Howard turned his attention again to scholarship and writing. He took part in something called the Highlands Institute, a forum for scholars devoted to an exploration of liberal religious thought. Howard turned his doctoral dissertation into a book on Adler's ideas. He authored texts on humanism, on medical ethics, and more. And speaking of medical ethics, he became a part-time professor of that subject at the University of South Carolina and established an ethics committee at a local hospital where he gained the respect of the medical professionals with whom he worked. For Howard, ideas are not merely disassociated abstractions, but true to his theory of knowledge, ideas grow out of practice and real experience, which are then plowed back into experience in order to enrich the intellectual soil, so to speak. For Howard, ideas are tagged to life, and to work with ideas is humanism in action. Now back in New Jersey, to be near his children and grandchildren, the story continues. Howard is involved in creating a humanist think tank, in leading philosophical discussion groups in the community where Rita and Howard currently reside, and remaining keenly attuned to developments in the ethical culture movement and the wider world of humanism. And in his 80s, Howard remains the chairman of the Jersey City Ethical Charter School, a school that he helped to found. And so we are now honored to give this award to Howard Radest. Howard Radest, who is an ethical culture leader, philosopher, scholar and author, visionary and administrator, teacher and mentor, world traveler, chess player, golfer par excellence, father and grandfather, devoted husband to Rita, now for almost 60 years, comrade, colleague, and friend. Howard, let me say across the room, more than anyone I have ever known, and I dare say more than anyone here has ever known, you have lived a life of humanism, a life of dedication to the ideas and values we hold most dear. You are, in fact, a living embodiment of our ideals. Howard Radest, we thank you and we honor you with the Felix Adler Life Achievement Award. You have given us very, very much, and we are very grateful. Howard, can you come forward, please? few years longer, and I'll get one too. It says the American Ethical Union presents Dr. Howard B. Radest the Felix Adler Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition for many years of service on behalf of the ethical culture movement, June 18, 2011. Howard, we present you this award with honor and gratitude.
I have limited remarks. You should, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I have limited remarks, which you will understand for an ethical leader is unheard of. My normal talk runs at least 50 minutes, and following my colleague from New York, Adler, might run at least twice that length. But I will behave myself. I will try to, in any case. I can't resist a kind of macabre joke about a woman who had just lost her husband and comes with her son to the funeral parlor for the service. And the preacher, who never knew the deceased, went on and on about what a wonderful human being he was. And pretty soon the mother leans over to her son and says, "Look in the coffin, is it Papa?" That's how I feel. Much thanks. Much as I may have helped and enjoyed some of you, I have grown and enjoyed myself. I've written my notes not because I lost my memory, it's close to that, but because I do want to limit what I say so we can get on with our business. I want to thank Joe. He is a wonderful successor to me and several others at the Bergen Society, and if you ask their membership, they'll more than agree. There are many names, and I'll say more about that. But I want to begin with some words by Dr. Adler, which is appropriate for this award. They were uttered at the New York Society in 1877 on the occasion of the first anniversary of the founding of our movement. And Dr. Adler said the following: "We felt a need. Religion, which ought to stand for the highest truth, had ceased to be true to us. We saw it at war with the highest intelligence of the day. We saw that millions are annually lavished upon the mere luxuries of religion, gorgeous temples, churches, and the elaborate apparatus of salvation. We could not but reflect that if 1/10 of the sum thus set apart were judiciously expended upon the wants of the many who are famishing, distressed more often to be relieved, sickness averted, and crime confined within more narrow boundaries. We saw around us many who had lapsed from their ancient faith, but still preserved the outward show of conformity. We beheld that the essentials of religion are neglected, even while its accessories are observed with greater punctiliousness than ever." That was Adler, age 27. I think I should tell you how I got here. I was appreciative of the early person who received the award. Where is she? She told you where she's coming from. I want to tell you that if I were to title what I'm going to be saying in the next few moments, it will be "Accidents Happen." And let me tell you a little bit about that. I was 22 years old. I was a member of Horace Callan's seminar at the New School. If you don't know, Callan was probably one of William James's favorite students. We spent Friday evenings together. One night, Callan asked me to stay behind when the seminar adjourned. he had received a letter from David Muzzy, who was also leader of the Westchester Ethical Society. Muzzy asked if Callan knew anyone who would be interested in ethical cultural leadership and whom he would recommend. Callan had a kind of puckish sense of humor. He was in his 80s, bright as they came. For example, the title of one of his great books, which I recommend to you, where the title was "Secularism is the Will of God." That was my mentor, Horace Callan. He showed me Muzzy's letter, asked if I wanted to be, and I quote, those words are still in my head 60-odd years later, if I wanted to be a rabbi without portfolio. I knew nothing about ethical culture. I was interested in a job, any job. I was a graduate student. I was in philosophy. You know what I'm talking about. The direction philosophy was taken, making it even more difficult, was being headed by the British. So they were doing linguistic analysis and logic and stuff like that, which bored me to tears. I have a grandson right now who is always bored. So the career of academic philosophy just didn't appeal. What was I going to do with a degree? I answered Callan rather flippantly to his comment by saying I'd try anything once. Nearly a year went by after that evening, and I just about forgot about ethical culture. But then, while I was visiting up at Columbia, where I had taken my bachelor's degree, I was visiting with Joe Blau in his office. He had been my English teacher, my mentor, and my friend at Far Rockaway High School. Also, I had been his babysitter for his children, and later did the weddings. And both of us came to Columbia at the same time, 1946. He came as professor, I think, of philosophy and religion. I came as an undergraduate student. Later, as you know, he was named an ethical culture leader, and so also became a colleague, and a wonderful colleague. He said he'd been talking with Horace Fries, who was professor of religion at Columbia, and whom I later found out was Felix Adler's son-in-law. And Muzzy had retired, so Fries was supposed to take on leadership training activities, but he was a wondrously interesting model of a forgetful professor. So he got around to it about 12 months later. In any event, he knew that Blau knew me. So he said, why don't you talk to him? So Joe talked to me. As a result, they invited me to lunch at the faculty club. A free lunch for me in those days was a good thing. The faculty club was tolerable, and I even had a cocktail, which they didn't even blink an eye at. And then, as we were leaving, after they had described ethical culture to me, what leadership was like, and was I interested, Horace Fries, later just Horace, gave me a book of Adler's An Ethical Philosophy of Life. That evening, I went back to my room, and the story Blau and Fries had told me about ethical culture was still in my head. And then I read the book, and it came to me, deed before creed. For someone who had been bar mitzvahed, and who got rapidly disenchanted by age 15, that's a whole other story. Deed before creed began to ring. Ethical religion. Leaders, a profession where everybody was supposed to follow his, I would say his or her, but in those days there were no hers. His talent. This was a kind of Emersonian influence. I learned that a leader was expected to be, this was my list as I got to Bergen, back in 1956. Congressional head, whatever that means, counselor, speaker, social reformer, educator, student, philosopher, fundraiser, and goodness knows what else. If I'd lived close to the Society meeting house, probably also janitor and deacon. But luckily we didn't. I went back to my room that first evening. I opened Adler's book and I couldn't put it down, even though there are parts of it that are almost unintelligible. I finished it later that same night. And it struck a chord with me that still echoes 61 years later. Of course, I'm a pragmatist, I'm a naturalist, and I'm a humanist. Adler was a post-Kantian idealist. If you don't know that distinction, I'll give you a philosophy course some year, but not here, all right? I called both Blau and Fries the next morning, and I said, yes, I was interested. They then put me on the interview round. The interview round included, later became a friend, Al Black, who was then head leader of the New York Society, Jerome Nathanson, Hank, I could never call him Henry, Hank Herman, and I then also met some of the leading laymen of the Society, very wealthy, very well spoken, very suspicious of this 22-year-old interloper. I also had to make the trek out to Brooklyn, which for me, though I'd been born in Brooklyn, was not a familiar territory. But I found my way to Henry Newman at Central Park West, who was a revelation. He was sweet, he was lovely, he was no youngster. He used to complain sometimes to me, you know, I used to be Dr. Newman when I became leader of Brooklyn. Then I became Henry. Then I became Hank. One day I'm going to become Hey You. That was Dr. Newman, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful human being. He, by the way, was a socialist and he meant it. When he stayed at a board meeting of the New York Ethical Society till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, he insisted, though we all begged him to take a taxi. And some of the more wealthy members offered to get him a chauffeur. And he looked at them with scorn and said, I'll ride the subway to Brooklyn. And he did. And he was never mugged as far as I know. But anyhow, I came as a leader in training, was named in *51, met some of my future colleagues, Sheldon Ackley, East Spatter, who's still alive, whose mind is still excellent, though his body's betraying him, Lester Mondale, Jeff Hornback, Ed Erickson, Henry Austin, I could go on. It was a fascinating bunch of people. And it was my colleagues. Meanwhile, I had another meeting, and I cannot resist saying so. I met Rita. We met at Surprise Lake Camp, where both of us were counselors, in the summer of 1951. For some strange reason, 4 months later, we were married. Neither one of us knowing what we would ever earn to support a household. She was a teacher without license yet. I was an ethical leader or trainee, but I hadn't even collected a paycheck. There we were that summer, where I had a commitment at Columbia first and then to work at a camp. So the two of us, newly married, met our first really working colleague. Some of you may still remember Florence Claver. Anybody remember Florence? Yeah, there's a few of you. We got to call her Floss. She was, I knew her initially as director of religious education and former teacher of ethics at the Ethical Culture School. And I said, oh my God, a Sunday school director, what the devil can that be? I I went to her apartment on Riverside Drive to meet her. Her first words to me after she took my coat and hat was, "What do you want to drink?" I did a double take, and she said, "Well, do you want scotch or do you want bourbon?" This was like no Sunday school director ever. She became also Aunt Florence to my kids, and a wonderful friend, and she stayed active and alive and functioning with me and others in our movement a good 20 years after her retirement at age 65. A wonderful, wonderful lady. But anyhow, I didn't start full-time work in New York until 1952, after becoming, following Callan's question, a rabbi without portfolio. Now, lots has happened over the decade, and I've already used up more of the time than I should have, so I'll move more quickly. I remember people, some of them in this room, and I hesitate to mention names, because for every name I mention, there will be at least a dozen I could have mentioned. I remember the Bergen Mafia. Joe doesn't remember them, or maybe he does. We used to have a 2-year requirement. No president could stay more than 2 years. So in my years at Bergen, I had 6 presidents. The 6 of us and their leader would come as delegates to an AEU meeting, and we would be a block. And that was the Bergen Mafia, and that's what they all called us. And it was good. It was fun. By the way, in those days, unlike today, gentlemen without jackets and ties are inappropriate. And to sing songs, as we did last night, would be for camp or AEU delegates. My knowledge of the history of religion, I hesitate to say this, is back then we were High Church Episcopalian. Nowadays we're moving happily, I may say, toward being basement Baptists. Which is fine. I think it's great. I'm not sure about leaders with guitars, Bart. But Bart was one of our students at the Institute, and it was a joy and pleasure to work with him for 3 years. So if he has some little items like guitars, I'll deal with it. I remember other AEU assemblies, many of them until about 91 when we left this area. I remember Camp Elliott, which Bergen started for a few years. Teddy Phillips, another man with a guitar. We're still in touch. We knew him when he was 6 years old. He became a counselor. We were all volunteers at Camp Elliott. It was the only way we could afford to run it. And that was true of our cook, Bert Spielman, who was a member of the New York Ethical Society, and of our counselor for the women, Marge Michelson, with her 2 kids, who was a member of the Rockland Ethical Society. Everybody lent their summer to keep that camp alive. And I remember that. It was an exciting, wondrous time to work with kids, and we did. The toughest age, the middle between infancy and childhood and teenagers. Not yet teenage-itis, but still hell to work with in groups. And we had fun with them, except you couldn't catch up on your sleep. Anyhow, I remember my 2 presidents when I was in this slot as executive director. Arnold Sylvester, a wonderful guy, a great artist, and a very successful businessman, and Werner Klugman. This is when we talk about Rose Walker's death. I remember the 2 Roses in Brooklyn. Rose Elbert and Rose Walker. And I remember there were times they loved each other, and there were times they didn't. And when they didn't, those of us who had some scholarly knowledge of English and European history said, It was the War of the Roses. Most of the time it wasn't. Both very active in AEU. I remember Gene Kotkin as a member of New York, then as executive secretary, then as a colleague, as an ethical leader, and so on. I remember the people who still keep in touch with us. Barbara and Roger Michaels. I remember Barbara's parents. The Rothschilds, not the rich Rothschilds, but rich enough. And they were so supportive. If you raised a question with them on a telephone and said, I need, their first response was, how much? And you then the next day or 2 days later, lo and behold, the how much was there. That was kind of the mood of people who were able to. People who weren't did the best they could, and they did indeed. Of course, we always were in a deficit. We used to say, if you didn't run a deficit, you weren't doing your job. Because there's always more to do than you have the resources to do. Anyhow, I remember that. I remember the leaders of the time. I know times have changed. Gender has surely changed, thank goodness. But in those days, we were like wandering missionaries. You'd have a home society, but you were expected, and you expected, every Sunday in the fall, spring, and the winter, to be on a society platform somewhere. This was just what you were. And you were then on your home society platform, and between those two obligations, I never got to do the Sunday Times crossword puzzle until July. Okay? But that was all right. We had a sense, I'm not romanticizing, that we were leaders of a movement, not of a society. And I got to know families in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Baltimore, in Washington, in San Francisco, in LA. Wherever there were ethical fellowships and societies, there were people we got to know, including their kids, and the mothers, and the fathers, and they became friends, and we knew each other. John Eliot used to make a remark about the smallness of the movement, and he'd say something like, well, the nice thing about smallness is we can hate ourselves face to face. That was a typical John Eliot comment. Anyhow, the nice thing also was that Rita and the boys traveled with us. So we weren't that isolated from each other. There was more, but I won't plague you with all that. I remember the schools. I remember the Institute. And now at 83, the excitement of ethical culture still remains. I'm not tired of it. I do get tired more often, but I'm not tired of it. Those who came before us, this is the sermon part, don't listen. Those who came before us, generations, set out to build a space for human beings, and they called it an ethical society or an ethical fellowship. Its purpose was clear thinking, moral idealism, the celebration of community, and a space where young and old, believer and non-believer, Jew and Christian and Muslim and Buddhist and freethinker and secular and whatever could come together. Could come together, whatever they were by color or creed, because they were dedicated to something else, to make a good world and to make a good person, including to make themselves that. And it made no difference the pathway you took. That was Adler's genius. That was Adler's insight. In the beginning, he offered a moral agenda. Some of you may know it. The moral agenda reacted to the horrors of Reconstruction, 1876. To the corruption of American politics, to the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of children and women. But it was also a time of hope, emancipation, a labor movement that was really being born, but would not fully become born until the 1930s. Public schooling, a cause, not simply something you expected to complain about. A cause, just beginning to shape itself in the cities and towns of America. A promise of undreamed of wealth. A fruitful marriage of science and technology. This was all there in actuality or vision in 1876. This was on Adler's moral agenda. This was what he went to work on. This was what he tasked his society in New York and then later Chicago, St. Louis, and so on, to go to work on. Ethical culture was the response to that environment. Well, here we are today, more than 125 years later. All right. The gap between rich and poor, it's still there, and growing worse. Terror is likely anywhere and everywhere. We choke on our own wastes. Dogmatism and superstition delude a desperate people. But it's also a time of hope. Adler never forgot it, neither should we. Silent for all these ages, people everywhere demand their right to be heard. And they are being heard today in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and here at home as well. It's a messy, unpredictable situation, but better than what went before. We create wealth where none existed before, but it's a wasteful wealth that needs its critics and its corrections. We have skills never before dreamed of, but they are used to trivialize and demean rather to enrich and celebrate. We reach across chasms of culture and geography in a world grown more various and more connected than ever before in human history. And that world is echoed daily in the places where we live, the communities we do have. So a movement dedicated to the knowledge, love, and practice of the right still has work to do. We have a chance to give life to it in the societies and fellowships we are and create. No matter where we are, no matter how big we are, no matter how small we are, we still have work to do and opportunities for that work. I will end with an apology for going on so long, with a word also from Felix Adler, a sentence I found of his, in which he says, at the end of his life, 1933, it was long about 1930, he said, I am grateful for the ideas that has used me. I close with those same words. I too am grateful. And I am grateful to each of you and all you stand for, the other faces that I would be seeing in those receipts. I am grateful to you for allowing me this moment to share my life with your lives. Thank you.